Year in America, there are more than 100,000 new cases of tuberculosis. Of all infectious diseases, tuberculosis is still the greatest killer. This film on tuberculosis presents aspects of its diagnosis, treatment, and control. Why? For one thing, industrialization has spread faster than industrial health programs. In spite of the progress of preventive medicine, in spite of public health programs on community, state, and national level, tuberculosis still attacks almost as many Americans today as 10 years ago. Although the number of deaths from tuberculosis has been gradually falling off. In some occupations, there remains the hazard of infection. Poverty and ignorance, whether in backcountry or in city slums, contribute to the spread of tuberculosis. Ignorance or negligence. And then there are wars, the greatest spreaders of tuberculosis. The work of scientists alone cannot eliminate the deadly bacteria that cause tuberculosis. It takes community action. In the city where Mary Smith attends high school, tuberculin tests are given to all pupils. In an organized effort to help patients like Mary, public and private hospitals have been built all over the country. We have mobilized against tuberculosis all the resources of modern science. We are constantly building better and more efficient tools. But only by checking an ever-increasing number of citizens, by going after tuberculosis before the disease spreads, can tuberculosis be conquered. Only if we fight it on a nationwide front can we achieve a lasting control over tuberculosis.
I can remember exactly where I was when my mother told me my father had died. We had snow. I was sitting on the step trying to put on my boots. She came over and said, "Sherwood, your father died last night." She was very depressed, and I felt concerned for my mother because what she had gone through. My mother's father had tuberculosis, and he died when she was 1 year old. Her mother had tuberculosis and was in and out of hospitals. My mother developed tuberculosis, and of course my father succumbed to tuberculosis, and then I had developed tuberculosis. It's mind-boggling. I mean it. You think of, you worry about both your mother and your father, but then you say, well, what's going to happen to me?
For centuries, people called it the captain of death. By the dawn of the 19th century, the disease had killed 1 in 7 of all people that had ever lived, more than any other illness. The ancient Greeks called it consumption.
The disease is what used to be called a wasting disease. You just get thinner and thinner. And so if you look at pictures of people who are dying of the disease, their cheekbones are very prominent, their eyes seem very large and hollow, all the flesh has wasted off their face and their throat.
No one was spared, rich, poor, young, old, and no one knew who was going to be attacked and how long they would live. Women who had children understood that their children might well become orphans.
The idea that although outwardly you may look like a healthy, beautiful 22-year-old woman, you are in fact vile in some way, contaminated. you know that something awful is happening in your body, and everything around you is sending a signal that you are disgusting in some way, that you have to be separated from healthy people. That seems like the most astonishing psychological burden.
Across the West, communities that had once lured health seekers now scrambled to keep them out. Several Western states sought to enact laws to stop people with coughs from crossing their borders. Others looked for ways to remove them from populated areas.
They often set up tent cities on the edge of town. So the sheriff would take them, drop them off in this tent city, and most people were kind of having to fend for themselves, and other people who had tuberculosis who weren't so sick would help them, and some charitable people would bring food and so on, but they were isolated and indigent.
In cities across the country, public officials began to call for government intervention. Health departments, primarily concerned with preventing diseases carried in the water supply, now had to confront a deadly illness.
Public health officials felt they had to conduct a massive national campaign to bring the news to everyone in the United States. In fact, it's the first mass public health campaign in American history. There's nothing like it before. The campaign to teach every single American that they needed to be careful about how they coughed and sneezed, because you could never tell who was sick and who wasn't.
And they passed these brochures out so that people could understand that spitting could spread the disease. Coughing without a handkerchief could spread the disease. They promoted the use of Kleenex. I mean, this is how Kleenex came about.
Women's hemlines start to go up after 1900. It was so you could get your skirts out of the dirt and not carry home a load of germs into your house. Men's style of wearing beards changed. The anti-TB handouts would say, get rid of your whiskers because you don't want to kiss the baby or kiss your wife and give them tuberculosis with your beard germs.
Crowded neighborhoods transformed as parks and playgrounds were built to provide urban dwellers with islands of fresh air. New Yorkers began to call Central Park the lungs of the city. By the early decades of the 20th century, improved hygiene started bringing the overall cases of TB down. But in poor, crowded neighborhoods, the figures continued to climb. In some cities, immigrants were twice as likely to die of the disease than their more affluent neighbors. For African Americans, the death rate was 3 to 4 times higher.
And suddenly you have a new understanding of why it is a disease of the poor and the immigrant. They are living in places without ventilation. They're working together in crowded sweatshops. So it kind of feeds on itself, a new understanding of the disease and the whole beginnings of policies to try to lessen the impact and reduce the spread of the disease.
Public health officials began to call for improving the lives of the poorest Americans, better housing and working conditions, reduced working hours, and child labor law. Yet the anti-TB campaign gave government officials unprecedented power to police the sick. Health inspectors were instructed to monitor people's movements, inspect their homes, or commit them to ill-equipped public institutions, often against their will.
The pressure from public health officials to segregate the very sick fell most heavily on working class, poor Americans, immigrant Americans. They did not go knocking on doors on Fifth Avenue asking, do you have any consumptives in the house? There was a sense if you were wealthy, you were going to be allowed to manage your illness however you wanted to. It was the poorer people who really felt the pressure from public health officials to make their sick relatives leave the home and go into one of these institutional facilities.
Sanitary measures are sometimes autocratic, declared a prominent health official. We are prepared to enforce measures which might seem radical if they were not designed for the public good.
It's an area of public health practice where increasingly the need of the community to be protected from the illness starts to trump the individual rights of the patient. When people say, I don't want to be taken away, their right to resist that is overridden in the name of public health.
How do we ever live with a contagion in our midst? Someone is sick among us. That person needs care and help. That person is also contagious and can give us what they have. What is the balance between taking care of the community and taking care of the person? That question's always with us, and it almost never has a good answer.
Hospitals were overwhelmed. To cope with the flood of patients, New York City's Bellevue Hospital transformed ferry barges into makeshift wards.
Some of the hospitals would only take people who were in their first attack because they didn't want to take people who were dying. They weren't in the business of caring for the dying. So sometimes you had to again change your name, pretend you were someone different, go to a different hospital. It became a game of trying to figure out how to survive and how to make it when you really had no resources.
And one of the ideas that they had was that they would go out into the country, they would be resting, they would be giving good food, and they would be exposed to the sunlight.
So the idea of the sanatorium was to create a place where people who had been infected could rally their body's healing forces to throw it off. We today talk about the immune system. They didn't use that language, but it's clearly the phenomena.
Yeah, I'd snow. I was sitting on a step trying to put on my boots. She came over and said, Sherwood, your father died last night. She was very depressed, and I felt concerned for my mother because what she had gone through. My mother's father had tuberculosis, and he died when she was 1 year old. Her mother had tuberculosis and was in and out of hospitals. My mother developed tuberculosis, and of course my father succumbed to tuberculosis.
Lately I've been working to see if my dreams could prosper. You could be for certain the money will come in proper. Young man on a come up cooking me no Betty Crocker. Type of heat that makes the steam that's making me my lobster. H-I-L-I-F-E, I am no imposter. If there was another me, I would divide and conquer. Combat all this misery, I should leave in a locker. You could go get 2 degrees and jobs still drop here. Sleep on me and catch some Z's, I will become a monster. Plant some seeds and grow some trees, I'm rolling homegrown ganja. Spit so much I wise up, I beat a Dalai Lama. That includes the animal and men than a mini mantra. Lyrics understandable, there sure is no dishonor. To mainstream I'm unavailable, it's step before dishonor. Message packed in my product, collect the dump data. I beat the beat so hard I should title this track Rihanna. The other day I wrote this in my notebook. First thought that I had is that I needed a dope hook. Something that was bad makes some grades go, oh look.